2024 presidential candidate, Cornel West, Green Party candidate, and former professor of public philosophy at Harvard University. Thank you so much for joining me, Professor West. I want to read part of what Justice Roberts wrote in his opinion, which really sums up this ruling. He wrote, quote, "Indifference to race is the only constitutionally permissible means to achieve racial equality in college admissions." You are a graduate of Harvard. You taught there for many years. What is your response?
No, my dear sister, it's a very sad day. I think Justice Roberts is so absolutely wrong that this decision, let us be clear and not be deceived, it's an attack on black people. The question of what do you do with the vicious legacy of white supremacy, in which Supreme Courts justified slavery for almost 80 years. They justified ugly Jim and Jane Crow for another 100 years of neo-slavery. And in the 60s, we had to raise the question, what are you going to do about these precious human beings you enslaved in Jim Crow for so long? And the response was, first, reparations. We'll try to repair some of that with affirmative action. Then it shifted to diversity. It said, no, we'll just have a number of different people. Now they say, let's be indifferent to race after nearly 100 years of slavery and your Constitution justifying it. Well, 100 years of Jim Crow and your Constitution justifying it. The Supreme Court has rarely been a friend to justice when it comes to black people. Now, what you gonna do with us? How we gonna come to terms with this? This is my question to Brother Edward Bloom. Now, he's a conservative Jewish brother. Thank God we got a lot of Jewish critics of Bloom and white critics and Asian critics of it, but he pits the Asians against the black folk.
Well,
he says, now let's get some Asians. The whites didn't work. Let's get some Asians to pit them against black folk and ensure that, lo and behold, we can have policies that result in ensure that these black folk don't gain assets. This is a deeper issue that has to do with how do you come to terms with the humanity of black people in a nation shaped by white supremacy. So that's what we're talking about. That's what Race Matters was about.
Professor,
and we have to proceed. Love you. No, go right ahead. Go right ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt you because I want to get in some reaction from an expert who was on our air last hour. His name is Kenny Xu, and he is the president of Color Us United. He agrees with the Supreme Court decision. He is Asian American, and he gives the perspective of those in his race.
I could point to race-based admissions as the reason why Asian Americans are being discriminated against right now. I mean, if you're an Asian American, if you had to score 273 points higher on the SAT to have the same chance of admission as a black person to Harvard, is that fair? I understand that people's lives are improved by getting into an Ivy League university, but that opportunity should be made available to people of every race, not just one.
What's your response to that?
Well, I just thank God he doesn't speak on behalf of all of my precious Asian brothers and sisters. Not at all. I would want to say, why are you working with Brother Edward Bloom? Or Brother Bloom is trying to gut Voting Rights Act too. This is not just about education. This is not just about diversity. This is about something much deeper. They're deeply concerned about trying to ensure that black people's humanity is affirmed, that black people are gaining access to power and positions that heretofore we have not. And all of the deodorized discourse about X and Y and equal rights and so forth. No, we got to be honest about this. Clarence Thomas, love you, brother. You ought to be ashamed. You wouldn't be here for what affirmative action.
Let me read that.
Joe Biden facilitated Clarence Thomas on the court.
Professor,
let's be honest about these.
Professor, I want to read part of what Clarence Thomas said in his concurring opinion. He said, quote, "Today's 17-year-olds, after all, did not live through the Jim Crow era, enact or enforce segregation laws, or take any action to oppress or enslave the victims of the past. Whatever their skin color, today's youth simply are not responsible for instituting the segregation of the 20th century, and they do not shoulder the moral debts of their ancestors. Our nation should not punish today's youth for the sins of the past."
Yeah, no, the brother Clarence, he's wrong again, doesn't it? The new Jim Crow is still in place. Mass incarceration is still in place. Segregated places of where we live, segregated schools that we go to are still in place. So that when you talk about, well, Jim Crow is over, no, Jim Crow Jr. is very strong and operating. Mass incarceration is a form of Jim Crow. In some ways, even an extension of slavery. So, Clarence, you're wrong, brother. Love you. You're wrong as you can be. And in fact, we're going to have to come up with some creative, loving, civically oriented ways of wrestling with this vicious legacy of white supremacy. You don't do it by claiming, Justice Robert, we can be indifferent to it. You can't be indifferent to a practices that are still shaping the precious lives of young people in barrios, as well as ghettos, as well as reservations. And I would go, of course, I want to talk about our poor white brothers and sisters, because I think actually socioeconomic criteria is part.
I'm glad you brought that up. I'm glad you brought that up, because some critics of affirmative action argue that there are other factors like class, like income, that should be determinative here. And that, if anything, it's income equality, not skin color, that should boost a student's chances of getting into a university. Would that be better, maybe a fair approach, more fair than the system that existed until 2 hours ago?
I have always argued that these programs are not just for the children of the black bourgeoisie and the black educated class. They're for the brilliant ones coming out of poor and working class communities. And let me say this on a very personal note. There's two magnificent human beings who were the architect of the Harvard admissions. Chase Peterson, he's my Mormon brother. I was blessed to write the preface for his memoir. He was the leader of the admission process. He brought in another brilliant brother named David Evans. Together, a white Mormon and a black brother from Tennessee with a Princeton degree reshaped Harvard for 50 years. Because before that, affirmative action was white. We know the great book by Ira Katz-Nelson. Affirmative action's been white for 180 years and people didn't say a mumbling word. And then all of a sudden you get affirmative action tilted toward black folk and civilization is coming to an end. We've got to be vigilant about our rights, vigilant about liberty. Please, we see the hypocrisy. We see the discrepancy between your words and your actions. And let me say this too. We're never surprised by setbacks. We are never in any way paralyzed by despair. Sister Jackson, Justin Jackson is right. We shall continue to fight. We shall overcome. We shall produce our love warriors and our freedom fighters and our joy sharers and our wounded healers. That's the legacy of Frederick Douglass. That's the legacy of Martin King and Fannie Lou Hamer. So we tell the country and the world, we know we've been attacked, but we coming back with moral and spiritual power you've never seen before.
Professor Cornel West, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.